So yes, my name's Sean, Director of Policy at Center for Energy Ethics. What I'm going to present today is a paper that's in press with Antipodes, so it should be coming out online first in the next few weeks and then in print thereafter. And so this is part of a larger project. So I have a book that's just about done with New York University Press and a series of papers based on this project, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. So this research has been going on since 2018. It's based on Houston, Texas, but there's implications for the UK. And it's an ethnography with people working at the intersection of energy and finance. So interlocutors, which is a fancy word of saying people that you do research with, or study, include private equity partners, managing directors, bankers, but also engineers, physicists, consultants working in hydrocarbon, oil and gas. Energy more broadly, but in this project is specifically focused on oil and gas. And so this research culminated in a couple of hundred informal interviews, hundreds of pages of notes, over 70 in-depth recorded interviews, participating in many industry events, and being very much integrated into this community to try and understand how it is that people in this community operate, see the world, the decisions that they make. In many ways, the larger aim of this project is to see, what sort of things come to bear in their ethical frameworks. Like, what do they think, how do they decide what is good and bad in the world? And so this paper is one small slice of that research. And so this is a much longer paper, so this is going to be very much a synopsis, and I'd be happy to share the longer paper with you. So I'm going to start with a vignette with an interlocutor called Jason. These are all pseudonyms because it's all anonymous, so I have to protect their identities. Then we're going to go into the types of storage, and then we're going to go into how storage is entangled with our understandings of these materials, which then is going to lead into how we understand carbon dioxide. So the idea is that the materiality of these substances is very much entangled with how we treat them, how we understand them, how we govern them, and ultimately how we store them. So let me get started. I met Jason at a steak and seafood restaurant just west of Houston's downtown core, in the city's luxury shopping district. It was a warm, sunny day in July 2019. Like other interlocutors I came to know, Jason had worked in the industry for decades. He started in the tax department of an oil and gas firm while he was a student in college, before working as an oil and gas lawyer and later as a vice president for an oil company. It was while he was a VP that he became excited about the business of moving and storing hydrocarbons. He explained to me, while I was at ABC firm, we developed offshore and onshore gathering systems. We developed salt cavern gas storage facilities in salt domes in Texas, just east of downtown here. Salt cavern storage is just like this glass right here, as he said, pointing to this glass of iced tea in front of us. It's just an open cavern. You can stuff gas in there under pressure, and then bring it back out when it's needed. Several years later, he started a new business and bought 2 natural gas storage facilities, one of which included a legacy oil field. He continued, this is a picture because we're eating oysters at the time at this restaurant, so he's telling me this stuff. The 2 facilities we bought in North Texas are what they call depleted reservoir storage facilities. So at one time, they were producing oil and gas fields, he said. They were converted to store gas, so you're just putting the gas back down to where it came from, where it came from to begin with, end quote. For Jason, this subterranean storage facility was far more exciting than the companies would pay him to store natural gas. And when it was injected into the storage reservoir, it interacted with oil deposits, creating more oil and gas to be extracted than was initially injected. He explained, what happened is you put lean gas from the pipelines, it would mix with all that oil and re-enrich. So we were producing anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 barrels of crude oil, and then the rest was natural gas liquids. That was a very profitable enterprise. Between the production and the storage revenue, we were generating $75 million a year. But natural gas was not always a prized substance that it is today. Indeed, over the past century, natural gas has evolved from, what I'm arguing, an excess nuisance to a liability to a potential asset turned commodity in ways that parallel the unfolding understandings and treatments of carbon dioxide. Changes in the perceptions of hydrocarbon and carbon dioxide both have been the impetus, I suggest, for reimagining how they are stored and the assetization of geological spaces that contain them. Humans have long utilized subterranean strata for extracting and storing things. Industrialization has been characterized by the rapid and expansive extraction of subterranean materials, building materials, and other substances such as water. These extraction activities have and continue to entail various types of subterranean access, from tunnels to boreholes, and are codependent on various kinds of crystalline structure and porous geological structures that facilitate this access. Over the last several decades, these underground spaces have been reconceptualized and repurposed for storage of materials ranging from nuclear waste to hydrocarbons, and more recently, carbon dioxide. Salt caverns and increasingly depleted oil and gas reservoirs are valued spaces for storing oil and gas. Both forms of storage have existed for decades. Depleted oil fields have been used to store gas since around 1915, and salt caverns since around 1950s. But as Jason suggested, these subterranean storage spaces are qualitatively different and imbued with distinctive geological characteristics. Naturally occurring and solution-mined salt caverns, as you can see here, this is how they mine these salt caverns, located 250 to 2,000 meters underground, can provide value storage for hydrocarbons because of the impermeability of salt layers' crystalline structure, which has the capacity to, quote-unquote, heal cracks when it's fractured. So the salt actually moves a little bit with geological time, and it can seal itself. By contrast with the hollow container-like structure of salt caverns, depleted oil and gas reservoirs, often located 400 to 250 or 2,500 meters underground, rely instead on microscopic porous spaces between the rock granules in the reservoir rock, where oily and gaseous hydrocarbons are geologically stored. These deposits are known to migrate over thousands of years from the source rock containing the ancient marine life to pools of reservoir rock, which are then trapped between impermeable layers of salt and shale. These pools are known as conventional oil and gas reserves and are connected to the porous impermeable reservoir rock through which hydrocarbons migrate and where the majority of the oil and gas remains confined. As you can see sort of here, this is a very simple graphic of how you might understand conventional oil and gas and shales going down to the source rock, and these rocks where you contain oil and gas. Over the last 2 decades, the combination of horizontal drilling and multi-stage hydraulic fracturing, also colloquially known as fracking, has allowed the exploration and production companies to access previously inaccessible deposits confined within this rock. Repurposing depleted reservoirs and injecting gas, as Jason did, means utilizing and giving financial value to these microscopic spaces, where the injected gas interacts with the residual oil and gas deposits in the reservoir rock, augmenting, importantly, both the materiality of the gas and its financial value when it's re-extracted. As subterranean facilities, these locations of storage are an example of resource-making activities in the geospatial operations of the US oil and gas industry, as is the porous and crystalline structures themselves. It's actually these structures that are the resource being capitalized with excess hydrocarbons. The idea here, as advanced by various scholars, is that resources aren't just out there, but they're made by people, not just through processes of discovery, but through valuation. How do we financially value them? So there's a paper I wrote that engages with some engineers and geophysicists, and one of the conclusions was oil reserves don't really exist unless we could put a financial value on them. So there's this idea of resource making, and we don't just discover them, but they don't count as resources unless they're financially and otherwise valued. It is also relatively recently that natural gas has been the object of storage, making it not only a resource for the impetus of further resource making, Thus, Jason's story must be understood, that story about using these different store spaces, must be understood not only within the technological improvements and advances in expertise that have allowed for the transformation of underground geological strata into new spaces of capital exploitation, but also a century of changes of how natural gas is conceptualized, used, and financially valued, and ultimately governed. This is a story that we're going to see repeated with CO2. So how do we understand this? In the late 19th century, legal scholar Bernard Clark observes that the United States courts conceptualized oil and gas reserves as, quote, and this is important, a quote, akin to wild birds and animals that roamed the land. Under this interpretation, US courts adopted a common law theory of hydrocarbon private property known as rule of capture, which specified that, quote, property, wild game, could only be owned when reduced to possession, that is, caught or killed. For example, in 1889, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, in a case regarding mineral rights to natural gas, stated in its ruling, quote, water and oil, and still more strongly, gas, may be classified by themselves, if an analogy not be too fanciful, as minerals fair nature. In common with animals, and unlike other minerals, they have the power and tendency to escape without the volition of the owner. They belong to the owner of the land and are part of it, so long as they are on or in it, and are subject to his control. But when they escape, they go on to other land, they come under another's control. The title of the former owner is gone. Possession of the land, therefore, is not necessarily possession of the gas. That's a quote from the Supreme Court. 30 years later, in a case involving the partition and leasing of mineral rights to drill oil, again, I can explain all this in the question period, like what's the difference between mineral rights and owning the land and all that stuff. The Court of Civil Appeals in Texas similarly stated in its ruling, quote, there can be no definite sale and delivery of oil or gas in place because of their fugitive nature, since they are supposed to percolate restlessly under the earth's surface, even as the birds fly from field to field and beasts roam from forest to forest. Thus, informed by the vagaries of very early scientific geological knowledge, US courts grappled with the understanding of the materiality of oil and gas and how it moved through imagined subterranean worlds, as well as its lively characteristics. Unlike hard minerals like coal, that were understood to be stationary and as such could be unconditionally owned, courts instead relied on the rule of capture rooted in English common law. And pertaining to wild game, that the first person who captures a particular resource has the rightful ownership to it. This is a legal precedent that existed up until at least the 1930s. In many ways it still exists, but there's some caveats here. And what this law did is it precipitated the common practice of letting oil wells flow at maximum capacity for as long as possible, even if there was not enough storage for all this oil to come out of the ground, stored over ground pits and wherever else. Now, this is mediated to various degrees by other laws, but we can talk about that history. Crude oil's subterranean co-constituent, natural gas, has never been the prize of aspiring oil men or oil majors alike. While natural gas can exist on its own, it is often also found alongside crude oil and also known as associated gas. Surveying the history of the US oil industry, Charles Blanchard observes, since the industry's earliest day, quote, the lucky struck oil, the unlucky struck nothing, and the truly unlucky struck an uncontrollable, unstorable, entirely useless compound natural gas. So, while municipal gas works have existed in the United States since the 1880s, these were a product of coking coal, that is, purifying coal so they could be used for steel production. Baltimore was the first city in the United States to use coal gas to heat streetlights in 1816, and we see that sort of technology being used here in the UK 30 years before that. Natural gas originating from underground hydrocarbon reserves have been captured and transported by pipelines in the United States since the 1920s for use by utility companies. But until the pipelines were built, the gas was a waste product of oil production because it couldn't be reliably stored or transported or sold, thus making it quote unquote worthless. As such, natural gas that has been extracted with crude oil have largely been vented and flared into the atmosphere. So venting is the idea that we just sort of let it go. Flaring is we burn it. And the idea is that if you burn it, it's actually less dangerous than if you just vent it for anthropogenic and other reasons. But this isn't just a practice of the past. Data suggests that flaring and venting from natural gas from crude oil extraction in the United States exists today. And so this is a graph going from the 1930s to today, looking at gas vented and flared. So just to put this in perspective, my research was in Texas between 2011 and 2021 in Texas, which is the largest oil-producing state in the U.S., flared or vented 1.4 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That's a lot, 1.4 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Unconventional oil extraction, so fracking, has made the problems of nuisance gas worse, as many told me, as this form of extraction produces much more, if not more, natural gas than crude oil. Interlocutor Hakeem Deneau explained that flaring and venting was essential for crude oil production because the facilities to store and transport gas were either unavailable or unprofitable. So in many cases, many of the producers I talked to said, I don't know what I'm going to do with this stuff. Like, I have nowhere to put it, and I can't make money off it. I'm losing money, so I'm going to vent it or flare it. Most often, they would flare it for regulatory reasons. The U.S. Department of Energy lends credence to these claims. So if you go to the U.S. Department of Energy, this is what they state. Quote, the reasons behind flaring and venting may be related to safety, economics, operational expediency, or the combination of all three. The lack of direct market access for gas is the most prevalent reason for ongoing flaring. Economics can dictate that the more valuable oil be produced and the associated gas burned or reinjected to facilitate production. So what this history exemplifies is a socially entangled process by which oil and gas have become commodities as they are commonly understood today in the United States, and I would say even more broadly. From early conceptualizations as wild animals, how oil and gas are understood and financially valued as resources has been dependent on people's ability and their desire to enter these carbonous substances into assemblages of transportation and storage. And part of my impetus for this research is, like, if you've been to Houston, you'll know that if you go to the southeast of the city and all the way to Galveston Bay, there's this huge hydrocarbon infrastructure, all these pipes and flaring, and you're like, wow, this is an absolute incredible industrial complex. But then when I realized that all of a sudden this industrial complex is connected to this even more vast underground complex of reserves and other sort of spaces, I realized just the vastness of it. So connecting those two, you start to realize that there's this geological infrastructure right under your feet that's connected to all these pipelines and fracking towers and cracking towers up above. So what do I mean? And so indeed, as wild substances, it is these assemblages, that idea to contain them, that is vitally enables financial valuation of oil and gas, because the transportation and storage infrastructures allow for containment and control as private property. The valuation and impetus to contain these substances is entangled with their materiality. So let me explain. What do I mean is entangled by their materiality? First, think about the difference. Crude oil, when crude oil was first refined, it was primarily used for lubricants. They didn't really know what to do with this stuff. Crude oil is now refined into numerous products, from jet fuel to asphalt, depending on the particular chemistry of the oil. So depending where you get the oil, it's a different chemistry. Natural gas has fewer refinable products, ranging from propane to methane, thus making it less financially valuable in terms of the number of refined products that can be made from it. Secondly, the materiality has implications for how it is stored, and I suggest how it has been understood, both historically and currently. When crude oil emerges from the earth, it emerges as a liquid, with various viscosities that's composed of complex hydrocarbon compounds, chains of carbons and hydrogen atoms, as well as varying amounts of sulfur, nitrogen, and other trace elements. Natural gas, meanwhile, emerges as a gaseous compound that is primarily composed of methane, along with various amounts of propane, ethane, butane, carbon dioxide, and other elements. Oil can be seen, touched, smelled, and tasted, although I don't recommend it. Natural gas, like an apparition, like a ghost, is unseen and excites fewer senses. So if resource making, as scholars Tanya Richardson and Giza Rascalnis have argued, is bound up with humans' material experiences and practices, then I suggest it is this materiality is why natural gas, as until recently, remained a wild substance in the United States. Whereas the release of crude oil into the environment has immediate and observable material consequences, from floating on water to cover flora and fauna, it is not possible to immediately observe natural gas once it is released, or its anthropogenic effects. So taking the argument one step further, before I move into the example of carbon dioxide, it is precisely the gaseous material that has and continues to make venting and flaring a vital and accepted part of what Mike Simpson here at the department calls a pluritemporal spatial capitalist strategy of many US hydrocarbon companies. With some exceptions, and until the anthropogenic impacts of natural gas became better understood, natural gas has been far less governed than crude oil, and indeed, in the United States, has primarily been governed through the process of disassociation. That is, the release from control, its property titles renounced, and left to roam. Long unseen and under notice, the advent of new monitoring technologies and changing understanding of its health, ecological, and climate impacts, even amongst those in the industry, have moved venting and flaring of natural gas from the realm of relatively innocuous common business practice for many years to an increasingly anthropogenic public health liability. An increasing volume of evidence, as many people will know, indicates that venting and flaring significantly contributes to anthropogenic climate change and disproportionately affect the poor and marginalized communities who are more likely to be located near these activities, especially in Houston. Houston's a very interesting case study because it has no zoning bylaws, which in some ways is a very interesting way for the city to unfold in very innovative ways, but in other ways, it also means that some of the poorest communities are located in areas that are most heavily polluted. So in the face of this evidence, there's increasing pressure on the industry to store rather than release gas, which is conveniently dovetailed with natural gas being repositioned and portrayed by those in the US hydrocarbon industry as a transition fuel. As calls to transition away from oil have increased, these narratives have ascertained new currency. From toxicity to climate change mitigation, there are mounting political, economic, and social reasons being advanced within the industry and society for storing natural gas rather than leasing it and combusting it in the environment. And many of the interlocutors I chatted with in the industry say the same thing. I suggest that the resurgence of these bridge narratives not only reflect an effort by those in the industry to secure the industry's place in the future and deflect criticism in some ways, but also reflect an effort to turn liabilities into commodities and to assetize new and existing subterranean spaces for natural gas storage. An effort, as I'll show in the next slide or two, in some ways is being replicated within the US oil and gas industry with regard to carbon dioxide. So this is another vignette. So in part of my field research, I went to a lot of these private meetings and part of this community. At a monthly breakfast meeting of the Houston oil financiers in early 2022, a CEO of a medium-sized oil company explained how and why his company was diversifying into carbon capture and storage, CCS. While he emphasized that his firm was still a conventional oil company operating in the Gulf of Mexico, he explained that they had to adapt where the money was flowing, quote unquote. He rhetorically asked the audience, how do we adapt to where the politics are going? How do we adapt really where the transition's what the transition's about? How do we participate in it as an independent oil and gas company? Can we be a player? He asked. Selling this business diversification to a somewhat skeptical audience of oil and gas financiers, he argued that there are going to be investments in low carbon type businesses. The question was, who in the oil business was going to participate? Confidently, he said, quote, "We can play a role in carbon capture. We can play both in traditional oil and gas space and in the transition space. The principles of what make us a good oil and gas operators lends itself to CCS because CCS is about capturing carbon from industrial emissions, then transporting it, and then injecting it, and then monitoring it. It's ultimately something that oil and gas firms can participate in." The CEO explained that his firm has at least 2 dry holes, that's failed wells, with the right geology for CCS, for every one well that they drill. Saline aquifers, which are vital to storing carbon underground, meanwhile, are not difficult to find. "We drill through them all the time," he said. "In fact, we blast by them and don't even care." He wasn't especially enthused by CCS, but for him, there were 3 key financial elements: getting companies to pay to store carbon underground, capitalizing on what were otherwise quote unquote, worthless geological storage formations. You can see the sort of graphic here, saline aquifers, oil and gas fields depleted, and attracting new investors. He explained, quote, "It's a chance for us to reintroduce ourselves to investors. It actually opens up some of the funds that are now willing to take a meeting that maybe they wouldn't take 3 years ago. We want not only to be in front of those funds, but we want to be in front of those funds with a story. That's where CCS comes in," end quote. So fundamentally, his firm was an oil and gas company. The guts of our oil and gas model is to buy, redevelop, and explore hydrocarbons, he said. For him, saline aquifer CCS was not yet profitable, but it was a means by which to advance the mission of his firm amid shifting social and political concerns about climate change. It allowed the CEO to present his firm as central to curating a new social material order between the hydrocarbon industry and society. Storing carbon dioxide was not central to his firm finding and producing oil and gas, but enabled the firm to access capital to further its exploration and production activities. Selling storage capacity in these otherwise useless saline aquifers is a new frontier, I suggest, in the narration and governance of subterranean spaces for new storage purposes. In the ethnographic example, which I'll close this presentation with, the resource being acetized is the aquifer rather than carbon dioxide. So again, you can see this sort of distinction here, injecting it into the saline aquifer where it dissolves into the aquifer itself. Again, acetizing those porous spaces. Carbon dioxide, as some people have suggested to me, is indeed a commodity, but is produced in far greater quantities than our present-day uses for it. While it is unlike natural gas in its chemical composition and uses, the changing perception of carbon dioxide from useless excess to anthropogenic liability in need of containment is reflective of a similar socio-material trajectory in the perception of natural gas in the United States. It moreover underlines the vitally important role that forms of storage have and continue to play as the US hydrocarbon industry pivots toward a lower carbon energetic regime, as well as the importance of how forms of storage are narrated in the outward projection of good governance at a time when the industry is under more scrutiny than ever. So what I would close and say is that it's these subterranean spaces that are being used as sort of a means of good governance. So the hydrocarbon industry has for a long time been in negotiation with society about how it is a good steward of both society and the environment. These subterranean spaces are a key aspect of that ongoing negotiation. So I'm going to pause it there, but I think this is the sort of summary of the paper. There's a much larger paper behind this. I'd be happy to share the paper with you and talk more about this or any of the other aspects of the research.